Hello, Psych and Law. How are you this morning? Shall we get started? This all ties, I believe, to homework 9 it is, right? Homework 9, our next to last homework. We have lecture number 12 and lecture number 13. A small portion of the homework comes from lecture 12, and then the rest of it comes from lecture 13. So the first lecture is about jury selection primarily. And then the second lecture is about jury decision making. It's a big area, and it's rife with psychological implications. So let us get started then. Jury selection, the process is two parts. First is assembling a pool of jurors. So this is the potential jurors, the pool from which we will select ultimately the jury. So this is assembling the pool of juries. Fancy name is drawing the venire. So that's where we're drawing this body of people. Now, second step is once we have that pool, then we go to court and we then select jurors from that pool. Select is an interesting word because, and I'll leave it to you to decide, but what is more important here? Is the selection of the juror or the elimination of the juror? Because essentially, it's hard to know which is coming first, which is the chicken and which is the egg, so to speak. The fancy name for this is a French term, voir dire, to see and to speak, for those of you who are a little rusty on your French. And note that this is the first time that everyone, the defense, the prosecution, the judge, gets to see the jurors and hear them speak as they're asked questions. So jury selection, what's the goal? Well, we want to draw fair, unbiased, and those two terms are essentially synonymous in this context. So we want a fair, unbiased, and then the second part is we want a representative jury. That is, the jury should be drawn from the community in which the case is being tried. Now, court rulings since the 1880s have said you can't exclude potential jurors because of membership in a cognizable group. Hey, Annika, how are you doing this morning? And a cognizable group, that's a cool term, right? Annika belongs to a cognizable group. We call that group CATS. That is, we have a cognitive structure that is a container for these members. So a cognizable group might be African Americans, might be women, might be Italians, and so it goes, right? Well, but until 1960, jurors were overwhelmingly white, middle-aged men, and that was basically it. And when we look at how does this occur, well, right off the bat, we see that there was no consistent method for choosing jury pools. Go back to 1961, you have 92 different methods employed for jury selection in 92 federal courts. So it's like each court gets to do it their own way, and there's little in the way of consistency in this regard. So, Jury Selection, Service Act 1968, what do we know? Well, a series of Supreme Court decisions look at the process, and advise that the process needs to move a different direction. So, led federal courts to seek uniform criteria to determine who is excluded. And remember when I said just a couple minutes ago, is it about selection or exclusion? You be the judge, right? Propelled by the idea that heterogeneous juries are better. Now, right off the bat, we have an assumption here that could fall into question. That is the heterogeneous jury, that is a varied jury, right? A jury of our peers. Well, that means people from our community. That doesn't mean if I'm being tried that I get to expect to have senior lecturers on the jury, right, or academics. Although those people, I consider them my peers. In the eyes of the law, it's members of my community, right? Now, the heterogeneous jury, then, we believe is the jury of our peers and is better fact finders. Okay, but that's an interesting proposition that has been tested, especially in a lot of organizational research, right? That is looking at teams and mixed teams. A lot of work growing out of the research on groupthink, if you will. Right? Diversity will discourage majority group members from expressing prejudice, and this is one belief, right? Well, do heterogeneous groups, let's attack this assumption right off the bat, make better decisions? Well, lab studies do say yes for the most part, but tasks are far removed from jury decision making. type tasks, right? Usually what we're talking about in the laboratory is that we have a relatively straightforward correct, incorrect paradigm, and we measure, does this diverse group or this homogeneous group come to the better decision or get the correct answer? And then oftentimes there's a measure of speed that's employed as well in these paradigms. So there's a bit of a disconnect from what we find in the laboratory to what we might actually observe within the complexity of a courtroom scenario with a jury, and pretty high stakes when you get right down to it. And think about it, a laboratory study is probably not high stakes to the participants in the same manner that a jury trial might be. So the speed with which the decision is often made is often held up as a dependent variable that determines what is better. Now, does heterogeneity create diversity benefits? Well, will diversity discourage the expression of prejudice? Yeah, most likely it will, and there's a lot of studies that demonstrate that, but there is kind of a hidden factor here. It has its downfalls, and Bodenhausen et al. Did research on what they called the post-suppressional rebound, and they set up different experiments where people had to suppress the use of stereotypes for a certain period during the experiment. And then the suppression instruction was lifted, so there was no more need to suppress, and what we find typically is people then engage in the stereotyping, prejudicial comments, etc., to a greater extent. So it's like suppress, 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 and people often find the suppression difficult, right? But then when the suppression is lifted, boom, they experience it and they express it to a greater degree than they did pre-suppression. So hence post-suppressional rebound. But we've also found, and some research I did, Derek and I especially, that there may be contrast effects that are possible as well. And that is, if I'm exposed to an extreme exemplar, I'm exposed to someone who's got a very extreme attitude and opinion on the jury, they're somehow founded on the jury, a lot of times it's like, whoa, dude, that is way too much, right? And what happens is I start to distance myself. So extremity, if I'm at the center and this person's extreme, their extremity can often drive me to move towards the other pole, more so than I would have had I not been exposed to them. So these contrast effects are possible as well. Does diversity encourage public acceptance of the legitimacy of verdicts? Now, I think this is maybe even the more important question, and we can go back to the Rodney King police brutality beating verdict, when, in fact, 4 white police officers were exonerated from police brutality charges in the all-white Simi Valley, and we see downtown Los Angeles explode into riots. The verdict was seen as being illegitimate, and people responded in that fashion. And this gets back to Miller and Bolster, and we keep returning to this throughout this course. What is the justice system? Is it to do justice, or is it simply to create the perception that justice is being done? So you can see there's a lot here that the diversity encourages public acceptance and legitimacy of the verdict. It can, but again, we're yes and no, the Rodney King verdict. But the O.J. Simpson verdict was a fascinating in O.J. Simpson's murder trial, because, of course, O.J. was acquitted. And it was interesting because there was really polarization on the basis of ethnicity. African Americans were like, oh, great verdict, etc. Like 98% of African Americans polled said the verdict was correct. And interestingly, about 96% of white folks said, no, the verdict was incorrect. So go figure, right? You got to take it on a case-by-case basis. Let's talk a little bit about the methods for drawing the veneer. 68 law requires voter registration list to be primary source. So when we're assembling that juror pool, drawing the veneer, how is it done? Well, we go to voter registration lists and we send out the, hey, you got to serve on the jury notices to these folks. But let's step back and consider, okay, so who votes? Because those are the people, who votes are the people who've registered to vote. Okay. Do they differ from the population at large? are we drawing a representative sample? Because remember, that's one of the goals when we use voter registration lists. Well, young people tend to vote in lower numbers, so we're going to see fewer young people on the jury pool than in the community. People who move frequently often fail to update their voter registration, and they may drop off, and we might not be seeing those people. So the mobile might not. And then we know that the poor and certain minority groups vote in lower numbers, lower proportions, so they may be underrepresented on the jury as well. And that can be critical to getting a representative jury. So, possible remedy? Well, this is a pretty easy one to do, right? Not only can we then consult voter registration lists, but why not look at Department of Motor Vehicle lists, licensed drivers? Let's face it, the number of people, the proportion of people who are licensed to drive is significant, so that might be a good way to go. We can also look at perhaps people who are on public assistance, and that is food stamps, you know, like SNAP or like various welfare, unemployment benefits, right? All these people, we can tap into these different lists. And if we're concerned about representativeness, if we say, hey, look, our community is 70% white, it's 20% African American, 6% Hispanic, 4% Asian, just to get on the four groups there, Asian American, we could conceivably stratify the selection process and say on this jury, then we want X number of white people, we want X number of African Americans, we want X number of Hispanics, right? And what we do is then we run like 4 separate selection processes. And this is not all that strange or odd. If we want a representative sample when we're doing research, right? We're pulling in Psych 1100 students at Ohio State to do research. And sometimes we've wanted a balance in our lab of male and female participants. Unfortunately, what we get coming at us, the pool, so to speak, is about 60% female and about 40% male. If we want 50-50 in the lab, what we do is we stratify the selection process. We say, oh, okay, we're going to take 100 female participants, and then we're going to take 100 male participants. What usually ends up happening is towards the end of the experiment, we're running just males to boost that number up to 50-50. So there's a lot of ways that this can be done to the extent that we believe it's important to do it. Now, for all this work in trying to develop this unbiased pool, can we still end up with a biased jury? Well, yeah, of course we can. Those who are excluded or removed may be systematically different than the final set of jurors, and this is where it gets dangerous, if you will. Now, some groups are automatically excluded. The blind sometimes are excluded, and we can make a case if there's evidence that's going to be presented that's of a highly visual nature, then we might in fact feel legitimate in excluding the blind. And notice I say feel legitimate. I don't have an opinion on this. So the mentally handicapped. So at some point, people who have the inability to process information at a level that seems fair to the defendant and the prosecution, perhaps they should be excluded. Non-English speakers for, relatively obvious reasons. Non-citizens, that's just a function of the law. And then the one that on this list is probably most interesting is felons. So that is, convicted felons will not be allowed to serve on a jury, but notice that it's felons on trial, so the representativeness becomes an issue. But this issue also, should felons be allowed to vote, convicted felons be allowed to vote, kind of in the same vein. Now, let's look then. Those are groups that are kind of slam dunk on their dismissal, their exclusion. But what about some groups who used to be summarily dismissed? The deaf. Okay, but we look at some cases as people challenge these laws, these regulations. New York versus Guzman, what do we see? Judge ruled that deafness cannot be used as a cause for dismissal. And when you think about it, we have methods for doing pretty high-level interpretation, so that we can have people come in and sign. This so maybe shouldn't be an obstacle, right? Maybe there's a case or two where you can think where it might be problematic, but now women. What is it with women that they never served on juries until 1898? So we're talking, what, 110, 111 years of the United States without a woman on the jury. 1898. 1920, let's see the progression of getting women into the jury box, because it's a fascinating story. Only 4 states by 1920 had women on juries. 4, right? 1957, women in Florida had to register to serve, so they wouldn't receive a notice in the mail calling them until they had actually gone down to an office and said, hey, I'm interested in serving in a jury, please sign me up. And then maybe they would get called. Notice, far different from the way the men are treated. 1966, Supreme Court held that Mississippi could exclude, and this is 1966, right? I was, 9 years old. They needed to contribute their services as wives and homemakers so they could be excluded from jury duty, right? They needed to be protected from the filth, obscenity, and noxious atmosphere of the courtroom. And what kind of prejudice do we call this? Okay, if we're limiting women's access to certain elements or aspects of society to protect them, we call this benevolent sexism. That is, we're doing it for their own good. And that's, essentially the perspective of patriarchal society. So women used to be summarily dismissed. Let's look at some cases that start to change that. 1975, so I'm graduating from high school at this point in time, Taylor versus Louisiana ruled that jury service could not be confined to men. Okay. That's not going to happen anymore. Women, like men, had to be paid for their service, which is probably a nice idea, right? Can you imagine bringing men, paying them to be on the jury, women not being paid? Not so much, right? Until 79, women in Missouri could still automatically be exempted by signing a form and returning it. And those of us who've been called for jury duty be like, oh my God, I wish I could do that. Or not, but perhaps, right? One opinion of women on the jury, and this is going to come to us from the famous attorney Clarence Darrow. Women still take their new privilege seriously. They're all puffed up with the importance of the part they feel they play. And they're sure that they represent a great step forward in the world. They believe the sex is cooperating in a great cause. Like the rest of us, they don't know which way is forward and which way is backward, or whether one way is any way at all. Luckily, I feel my services are almost over when women invaded the jury box. Woo. All right, so let's take a breath and allow our fists to unclench for many of us. But, Clarence Darrow is certainly a respected and notable attorney. But maybe we don't necessarily agree with his opinion on this. So, women have had a long path to serve in the jury box. Now, voir dire. We got the pool, right? We've assembled the pool. We've gotten that far. So now we got a pool of jurors. I was called to jury duty several years ago in Columbus. It was a murder case. It was a pretty big case. And they were drawing a venire of 200 people so that they could ultimately get a jury of 15. That is 12 jurors, 3 alternates, right? And the jury selection process, of course, was going to be extensive. I asked Ohio State, because it was during the semester, and they said, this is a murder case, be prepared that it could go for a month or two. And I talked to Ohio State, the powers that be, from the psychology department on up, and said, can you guys get me a letter to excuse me from jury service? And they say, why? And I say, well, because who's going to teach my courses if I'm doing jury duty? Psych and law was one of those courses, and I'm the only person who teaches it. There was no alternate. And the school kind of looks, wow, if you had to teach, and then what happens if midway through this we have to cancel the course? What happens to all those students? Because they can't get a course mid-semester. They've already paid for the course. We have to refund the money. Many of those students are likely graduating seniors who are now going to lose it was just a nightmare. So they wrote me a really spiffy letter. And during the jury selection process, they asked, does anyone have reason to be excused, significant obligations, etc.? And I was able to sit down with the judge and the defense attorneys and the prosecuting attorneys, talk to them about it, and they said, yeah, you're excused. It didn't hurt that two of the prosecutors had kids who were Ohio State students. And they're like, yeah, no, you get out of here. So I missed my opportunity. I might have been dismissed otherwise. I don't think I'm a good, because I lecture about this shit. I would have a hard time paying attention to the case because I'd be paying attention to all the processes and mechanics. So anyway, didn't do that one. Maybe when I'm older and retired, I'll get my chance, right? So the goal of voir dire then, we want a fair, remember fair and unbiased, right? Fair and representative jury. That's the goal. But, hey, pie in the sky, this is theoretical. What happens in the real world? Well, actually, attorneys want to identify and eliminate unfavorable jurors. So again, is this about selection or is it about exclusion? Well, there you go. Indoctrinate and influence potential jurors. And I think this is, to me, one of the more fascinating aspects of voir dire. I'm going to argue that the trial's already started when we go to voir dire. Because what's happened? We have the attorneys that are all present, both of the prosecution and the defense. We have the judge. We have everyone who's going to be a juror sitting there, essentially, right? We probably have the defendant, maybe not, but everyone who's going to be involved in the trial is basically there. So the work has kind of already begun, and as an attorney, one thing that I want to do then is I have this opportunity now to speak to the jurors for the first time. I might want to indoctrinate and or influence those potential jurors before the trial has started officially, right? I want to create a positive impression of myself as an attorney, either district attorney or defense attorney. And I also, if I'm the defense attorney, want to create a positive impression of my client, right? So there's a lot going on here that's kind of on the down low, off the radar, if you will. Now, let's take it into current events. We have a jury selection process that just finished as of yesterday, so I'm going to talk a little bit about this. The alleged murderer of George Floyd, that is Derek Chauvin, former officer Derek Chauvin, faces a trial after posting $1 million bail in October. It was a video footage was seen across the world. Derek Chauvin with his knee pressed on the neck of George Floyd for about 9 minutes before he died. And man, this is pretty shaky. If you guys remember when we were talking about psychology of the police, and I'd mentioned that my friend from the SWAT team, John, did the chokehold on me. I asked him to. I said, John, what's this chokehold deal? Let's check it out. And he says, well, I'll do it, but you have to tap my arm, right, as soon as you feel yourself going out. And that's what he did. He put his arm up against my carotid artery, twisted his wrist, expanded the muscles in his arm, and cut off the blood flow to my brain, and I was going down instantaneously. I tapped his arm, he let go, and boom, I'm back because the blood flow is restored to the brain. I know what a chokehold is, and I know if it's employed properly, it takes about 2 seconds or less. What the hell is going on when an officer has his knee on somebody's neck for 9 minutes? That's not a chokehold. It's something else. Now what we want to call that, what we want to determine that is, leave that to the jury, leave that to the defense and the prosecution. But I can assure you, based on my experience with highly trained officers, that Chauvin was not employing a chokehold. He had a knee on the guy's neck, right? He wasn't trying to cut the blood flow in the carotid artery. So, and Floyd can't breathe. Notice that when you do a chokehold, you're not obstructing anyone's breathing passage. So something else was going on there. Let's see what the jury does with that, right? So now the former U.S. Police officer faces trial on second-degree murder and second-degree manslaughter charges. And here's a memorial to George Floyd, one of many Right. So the Chauvin trial jury selection, a pool of eligible local citizens has been called to appear by the Hennepin County in Minnesota. From them, a jury of 12 and 4 alternates will be selected. It could take weeks, and it's now completed. Although highly unlikely, potential jurors will have no prior knowledge of the case. And remember, we talked about pretrial publicity in the previous lecture. George Floyd's death in May last year in Minneapolis inspired weeks of global protests. Global protest, right? They will be questioned to determine whether they are able to judge Derek Chauvin fairly. So we want a fair, unbiased, and representative jury. It appears there will be no change of venue and or delays. The defense had asked for both of those, and on March 22nd, just a couple days ago, the judge said, no, we're going on time and we're going in this jurisdiction. Now, I got more on this, so I'm just going to lace it in as we move through. Okay. Types of challenges for dismissal from the jury pool. Juries can be dismissed in 2 ways. First of all, they can be dismissed for cause. It can be challenged. There's a specific reason why jurors should not serve, right? They may be inflexibly biased. They may be prejudiced, or they might have a special relationship to parties in the case. So any of these might be reason for exclusion, right, on the cause. Now, cause challenges are unlimited in theory but rare in practice because they're hard to get at, and they have to be pretty egregious. They have to be pretty straightforward. Let's suppose we have a Jewish defendant and we have someone with a swastika tattooed on the side of their neck, right? I might be able to make a case as a defense attorney with my client. As a Jew, I say, man, I don't know, the guy with the swastika on his neck, I move that he's dismissed. That to me is demonstration of a pretty strong bias. And that one will probably fly, but we got to make it pretty obvious, right? Now, peremptory challenges, in this case, we can exclude jurors without reason. So this is just, hey, number 3, get him out of here. Number 12, get her out of here. Number 15, get her out of here too, right? The number varies by jurisdiction and judge, and that will be then set up. So, what do you think? How you feeling about that jury? And that's, of course, Michael Vick was arrested and then charged with engaging in dog fighting, not the jury he necessarily wanted, right? Boy, I tell you what, that's one I don't understand. Dog fighting, etc. Any kind of cruelty to animals is just gets my blood boiling in a real hurry. Okay, peremptory challenges then. Number varies with jurisdiction, seriousness of crime, the type of case. The criminal cases, defense usually gets the same or more than the prosecution. We'll look at a minute at the Chauvin case. Civil cases, both sides get the same amount, and it's usually less than criminal trials. Felonies, the feds give the prosecution 6, the defense 10. Right? Defense can petition for more in special circumstances. So the Chauvin trial jury selection, what do we know? The prosecution and defense can both ask Judge Peter Cahill to dismiss potential jury for cause if they perceive bias as we described. That would be for cause. The prosecution can also dismiss 9 potential jurors and the defense team 15 without giving any reason, although this can be objected to. So ultimately, what do we end up with in the Chauvin case as of yesterday at the taping of this? Not of your viewing, the jurors for the Derek Chauvin trial. What do we see? We see 15 jurors selected, so that's 12 plus 3 alternates, 6 white women, 3 black men, 2 multiracial women, 3 white men, 1 black woman, 10 are under the age of 50, the youngest in the 20s, 5 are in their 50s or older, the oldest is in the 60s. Does this mean anything? Here I am, I'm a card-carrying social psychologist, and now what I'm doing is referring to gender and ethnicity and discussing it like it means something. And that is getting me a little nervous, because if I endorse any comments about this, to what extent am I engaging in stereotyping? Which is like an ultimate taboo to a social psychologist. I mean, we understand stereotypes. So, as we move on here, rulings for the use of preemptory challenges. And this is a big case, Batson. So Batson, when you hear this is like Brady in terms of discovery, Batson in terms of preemptory challenges. Batson versus Kentucky. A lot of these cases come out of the South, right? So, blacks cannot be systematically excluded from a jury of black defendants. So we got a black defendant, and what do we have? Well, we have in the South, black defendant, what we're going to do is exclude black people from the jury and continue to exclude them so we can get an all-white jury to assure us of a conviction in those cases. Because remember, one juror can vote not guilty, and then that's the determination, right? So the jury decision has to be unanimous, so you can see where white folk who are in power in the South, we got a black defendant, we want this person to go down. We can't have any black people on the jury who might, vote not guilty. Now, it violates the defendant's right to equal protection under the 14th Amendment. Now, Batson starts to become expanded by further cases, but also its application to different groups. So we'll look at both. Holland versus Illinois, right? No racial group can be systematically excluded from the jury of any defendant. Okay? Violates the defendant's right to a representative jury, representative of the community. Right? 1991, in two decisions, the Supreme Court held that striking jurors based on race is unconstitutional, and it violates equal protection of the jurors, that you have a right to serve, and your right to serve should not be disallowed because of your ethnicity. Right? So, how does this work out? How does this play out? Well, if a black juror is excluded, the lawyer must provide a race-neutral explanation. So, if I exclude, I use my preemptory challenge and I say, hey, I don't want number 17 on the jury, and we look and number 17 is African American, and then the judge is going to say, why not? Right? And now I have to give a reason. But the Supreme Court struck down a lower appeals court instruction that requires a plausible explanation. No, really, serious. So about any explanation is going to be okay. It doesn't even have to attain the level of plausibility. It appears that judges are going to accept just about any explanation that counsel provides. So on the one hand, you have, Batson as a protection, but then you might have current political climates that affect the application of Batson. Hey, Penelope, how you doing? Came up to say hello to everybody, and now take a nap. So the extensions of Batson, well, Batson has been extended to gender, so it can exclude women on the basis of their womanness, can exclude homosexuals, right? And you can see where this might occur if the defendant is a homosexual or the crime was perpetrated against a homosexual, right? So you can't exclude just on the basis of homosexuality. And in one case, Italians. And what the hell? What the hell do Italian Americans have to do with any of this? Well, you can see that maybe in prosecuting some mob cases, some mafia cases, or maybe a district attorney sought to exclude every Italian from the jury box because why ever, right? I mean, who knows, right? So, but Batson has not been extended in the cases of the obese. So obese can be excluded, and you say, well, but that might be about civil cases where obesity might have been a factor in someone's injury, right? So for civil cases. Bilingual, on the basis of religion, and little people are not protected by Batson. So go figure, and this will change over time. Now, homework 9, first part, what, sweetie, am I not paying enough attention to you? All right, so it's your turn. You got 3 trials, you got 3 juries. You pick right, you go home. Pick wrong, and do not pass go directly to jail. So I've set up 3 cases for you, and you'll see it in homework 9 in the assignment section, already posted. Basically 3 cases. And the 3 cases, selling pot to an undercover police officer, The second is drunk driving, and the third case is mercy killing. Elderly wife of elderly husband who's terminally ill with cancer and a huge amount of pain, right? And what I'm asking you to do is your team will meet, right? And you're gonna take each of the three cases separately, and you're gonna choose the jury you want. And the way I've done it is you have a table for each case, and you indicate how many of each demographic you want to comprise your jury pool. And what I've done is separate it by 4 ages, so I believe there's 4 ages, right? Like 18 to 26, and then early middle age, late middle age, and then elderly. So there's 4 age categories. There's 2 gender categories, so we're talking men and women, and there's 4 ethnic groups. So we got white, we got African American, we got Asian American, and we got Hispanic, right? Now, ultimately, the table, you make your choice, you write the number you want of each one of those demographic, and remember, each table has to add up to 12 because you're selecting 12 jurors. Right? So if I get busted for selling, if I'm a 20-something and I get busted for selling a bag of weed to an undercover cop, right? Maybe I want nothing but young white men on my jury, so I'd have 12 in the young white men category. Or maybe I have some other rationale for doing it differently. So it's up to you. Pick wrong, don't pass go, go directly to jail. So check that out. Now, during voir dire, what is happening? Well, it's to see and to speak. Juror admissions during voir dire, right? Just some historic cases. Some jurors in the Marsha Colby case, allegations of a child killing so disturbing they couldn't honor the presumption of innocence, right? And this is important to know because you're presumed innocent until proven guilty. But if a juror says, look, the allegations of her killing the child, that has got me so freaked out that I can't start with the presumption of innocence, then that person could be dismissed for cause, right? And this is why the jurors are interviewed, right? Close relationship with state investigator gives him instant credibility. Well, I know the person who investigated this case, and I know they're right on. They don't make mistakes, so, you know, and they found the evidence of her guilt, so that's it. I don't need to be convinced. Well, I'm sorry. Don't need you on the jury. Or maybe trust law enforcement. He knew to the point where he could believe in it. He'd believe anything they say. Law enforcement has a tough job, and they work hard, and they have no reason to lie, and so I just invariably trust what the police say. Well, then I'm sorry. If there's going to be police testimony, you've already decided beforehand that you're going to accept that testimony, then get off our jury, right? And these came to you from those of you who did the Just Mercy with Brian Stevenson. You already know these. Now, what about the Chauvin trial? Let's return to that for a minute. What are some of the questions that are being asked, right? And note, all this information that I've gotten on the Chauvin trial, I went to my favorite go-to news source about shit that happens in the United States. I went to BBC. So the British Broadcasting website, right? That's where I love to get my news, especially about the United States, because I think it's less biased than what we get in the United States, right? But let's look at the questionnaire. And I also love the article that they wrote about this because they're explaining American jury selection to the British and people across the globe, right? So I think they did a great job of explaining it. So my choice of using them as a source throughout this lecture. Each potential juror has already been asked to fill in a 16-page questionnaire about the case. What the hell's in the questionnaire? The main thrust is to determine familiarity with the case, pre-trial publicity, will it be damaging, and issues such as potential jurors' own interactions with law enforcement. Since law enforcement, well, former Officer Chauvin is on trial, right? Key questions include, how many times did you see the video of George Floyd's death? Okay, so we're going to look at pretrial publicity here in this regard, right? Did you participate in marches against police brutality, and if so, did you carry a sign? That is, how committed are you to fighting police brutality, and are you going to carry this fight into the courtroom and act not in an unbiased fashion, right? What are your views on the group Blue Lives Matter the movement supporting police, favorable or unfavorable? And then, do you believe our criminal justice system works? So, a bunch of questions like that to kind of better get to know the jurors. And notice, though, that the questions are very much directed to very obvious elements that could affect bias in the case. Other questionnaire, Professor Valerie Hans, jury researcher based at Cornell Law School, says the questionnaire is more detailed and personal than most pretrial documents. Asks about their deepest attitude on some of the most important political and social topics of the day. You know, this case kind of serves as a lightning rod, and what happens in this case is going to have relatively broad implications for future behavior, potentially of many different parties. Professor Hahn said the aim of the two teams is to get a sense of whether or not to prosecute, whether or not a prospective juror will be open to the kind of argument that they intend to make over the course of the trial. So if you're a staunch Black Lives Matter folk, right, and I can be concerned that you will not render an unbiased verdict in that case or process the information in the trial in an unbiased fashion, then I will probably seek to eliminate you in that regard. Okay, let's talk about lawyers. Lawyers don't get to go to court that often. I mean, we think, oh, lawyers in court. No, most of the work they do is behind the scenes and making settlements, etc., negotiating deals. Remember, the vast majority of cases are settled through plea bargaining, not going to trial. So when lawyers get to go to trial, they can get pretty damn excited about it. And when they get to select a jury, they get even more excited. And I've heard lawyers brag about their ability to select juries. Well, and they do as well as lie detectors do, and you remember that. So how do they choose? Well, they might employ implicit personality theories, that is, thinking that certain personality traits then lead to certain foregone conclusions or methods of processing evidence. They might have intuitions about group behavior, and this might be done with the help of consultants. So let's look at these various ways that lawyers might engage in this process. Okay. Implicit personality theories is our intuition about what kind of traits co-occur. So if I see this personality trait like openness to new experience, does that then mean that I will be open to new forms of evidence? Right? So we might try to use trait-based theories to predict behavior and perceptual style on the basis of those traits. With 25 years of being a psychologist, especially a social psychologist under my belt, this is a rocky path to tread, and it's going to be insanely unreliable, right? So, but it's used to form impressions, right? We use these intuitions and to form impressions about others, and then we use that to predict behavior. And Fritz Heider was kind of one of the leaders in that thinking. They have many important consequences, though, because selective attention, processing, and memory are affected by our pre-existing ideas. So based on what I believe certain types of people might do, then my attention becomes selective in that regard. I'll notice certain things that are confirmatory, and I'll tend to not notice things that disconfirm my initial impression, right? I process things that are consistent with my impression more easily, and it's more difficult for me to process information that's inconsistent. I'm likely to reject it, right? And I'm more likely to remember confirming evidence than disconfirming evidence. So is this important? Yeah. Now, what we're looking at, though, is the process of stereotyping. That is, I believe that this person, and maybe it's a 50-year-old white woman that's dressed conservatively, right? And I say, wow, that reminds me of the church lady way back in the day on Saturday Night Live, and she's going to come pretty hard. She'll come down pretty hard on this, not be too forgiving. Notice I'm engaging in this stereotyping process. Now, lawyers' theories, there's tons of them. 1985 primer on jury selection said, women are born, this is 1985, right? A book on how to select juries. women are born skeptics, and they're skeptical in direct proportion to the physical beauty of the female witness. So if I follow this advice and say, oh my God, I got a list of witnesses, look at that witness, she is beautiful. Man, I don't want any women on the jury because they're going to be skeptical of her because of her beauty, because we know how women are. And notice we get back to this stereotyping idea. The info you're working with is limited. You take a category membership. Oh, I've classified this person as this category member, and now I know how they will think and how they will decide. That's a bit of a leap, is it not? Tend to rely on visible, easily determined, especially prevalent characteristics, right? So gender, age, religion, occupation, things that we can look at right off the bat and just, okay, man, that's obvious, and then I'm going to categorize and I'm going to make my decisions based on that. Now, we played Who Am I? Back in the forensic assessment in criminal cases. Let's play Who Am I? Who am I? That is Marcia Clark, the head prosecutor of the first O.J. Simpson trial, the murder trial. And Marcia Clark consulted jury consultants. So she had 3 different sets of jury consultants she went through. The first 2 sets of jury consultants she went through, she rejected them, and then finally found a third that agreed with her. And that's problematic right off the bat. Who do we want on our jury? Well, Marcia Clark was convinced that she needed a bunch of black women on the jury. Now here's her stereotype. So Marcia Clark is saying black women have been physically abused in gigantic proportions, and OJ is a serial abuser, so black women are going to use this as a chance to settle the score against their abusers, and they're going to convict OJ. Well, it didn't quite work out that way. In fact, it was the black women who voted to exonerate OJ. So, and she says, but then she goes on to say, and she says, I come off very well to black women. Black women like me. Well, I mean, here we've got this kind of uppity, middle-class white woman who's, lawyer, prosecutor, etc. And she's saying that, yeah, really, black women love me. And OJ's like, you go, girl. So, based on what? And note that Marcia Clark is operating on this narrative that's infused with stereotypes, her view of the world, and she's using it to make a decision on selecting a jury. And it blew up in her face. It was a horrible situation. I mean, I'm not saying OJ was innocent or guilty. That's not where I'm going. But what I'm saying is the jury that she selected was not at all supportive of what she was trying to do. So she was just wrong. Okay? No. Think about it. Oh, Clarence Darrow again. Let's see what Clarence Darrow says about jury selection, not just about women. I try to get a jury with little education but much human emotion. The Irish are always best for the defense. I don't want a Scotchman, for he has too little human feelings. I don't want a Scandinavian, for he has too strong a respect for law as law. In general, I don't want a religious person, for he believes in sin and punishment. The defense should avoid rich men who has high regard for the law as they make and use it. The smug and ultra-respectable thin, they are the guardians of society and believe that the law is for them. All right. Well, thank you, Clarence Darrow. Could we have any more stereotypes fit into a single paragraph? It is a paragraph on stereotypes. Okay. Are you guys buying this? Think about your ancestry, right? I know there's a bunch of us. I got a little bit of Irish in me, right? Now, I don't have much. I got like 1% Finnish in my genome, so we won't count that. But, yeah, I'm smug and educated, so, but is this really going to help? All right, let's look at a different way of going. The one-verdict theory. This is more a process-oriented theory. That is, the final jury decision, according to this theory, is determined by the opinions of one strong-willed verbal juror. So now we're kind of predicting what's going to happen in the jury room. What's going to happen during deliberations. And how many of you believe that most people in the world are followers? And if you give followers someone who is respectable and admirable, if you will, are most people just willing to step in behind them, to listen to them and say, you know what, this guy's right, this guy's got his head on straight, this guy's smart, man, this guy's professional, we're good to go, right? So here, if I adopt this view of the way the jury room deliberates, then what I need to do is look for this key juror. I don't have to worry about the 11 lemmings that are going to follow. What I have to remember or concern myself with is the one leader, right? So, who is this person? Well, they tend to have high status and power in the real world, right? So they're of status and they have power, so they're used to having people follow them. They kind of exude leadership, if you will. Marcus et al., in their study in 2000, key jurors tend to be male, okay, extroverts, and, believe it or not, tall. And people... forgive the joke embedded in this. People tend to look up to tall people. No, they do. Example, what's the average height of an American president? Average height of an American president is 6 foot, give or take. Average height of the typical American male, average height of an American male is 5'10". So presidents are actually 2 inches taller on average than the average American male. Height confers a lot of information, and a lot of it is implicit, inferential, etc. But height is important, right? So executives tend to be taller. President tends to be taller. Extroverts, they're comfortable speaking, they're outgoing, they will engage with people, right? And male, because we operate with that bias. Now, 12 Angry Men. Think about this. If you haven't seen this movie, I strongly suggest watching this. 12 Angry Men. Henry Fonda is the key juror. And it's a murder case. A young Puerto Rican male or African American, I'm not sure in the movie, is alleged to have killed his father. The trial takes place. We don't see any of the trial. What we see is as the jurors walk into the jury room post-trial to go into their deliberations. And in the movie, what we have is 12 angry men. They're angry about this killing, and they want to see justice done. And they don't really know how to operate because, no one's experienced as a juror, all that experience. So they say, well, why don't we take a vote and see where everyone stands? And what we see is guilty, 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 guilty. Henry Fonda, not guilty. Everyone else, guilty, 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 11-1. And they're all now going to focus on Henry Fonda and kind of break him down. So they vote guilty so they can get the hell out of there. They can get this done in a hurry. They can convict this young man and move on with their lives. Well, during the movie, which takes place almost solely in the jury room, Henry Fonda starts looking at the evidence and starts talking to people because he's skilled. He's an extrovert. I think he was an architect in this, maybe not, but high status profession, etc. And eventually he turns the jury until it's 11-1, not guilty, and then finally they break down the last holdout and come back with not guilty. So, fascinating idea, and perhaps a more legitimate idea than the stereotyping that we've looked at previously. Now, another one is similarity leniency hypothesis. Jurors who are demographically or socially similar to litigant favor him or her. And there's some evidence that this is true, and this is actually something I wanted to research when I got to graduate school. And Phil, Dr. Tetlock, said, hey, so Mark, is there anything that you want to research? And I said, well, I was interested in perhaps investigating how perceived similarity might affect jury decision making. And Phil rocked back in his big leather chair. He thought for a moment, because he was that kind of guy. He was very thoughtful. And he looked at me and he said, similar how? And it's like I saw the words of that question coming at me. They went into my head and then they started bouncing around, and I realized the implications and my naivety and foolishness. Similar how? You got to do better than that. Because if you're not specifying the nature of the similarity, you're not getting anywhere. Similar is just too vague a word, right? And at that point, I just thought about it and I said, well, maybe it'd be best if you had something I could work on for you, and he gave me something, and I moved on from there. Interestingly, when I was teaching a section of 520, which is now 4520, the experimental social psychology research class, I was doing a lot of jury decision-making projects with the students because the students liked that and they found it interesting. And students actually solved this problem in one of their experiments because they said, what we're going to do is we're going to tell participants, one of our independent variables is we're going to tell participants that the defendant is similar to them or that the defendant is dissimilar to them, and see how it affects their decision making. Notice the simplicity and the brilliance of it, and I love working with undergraduate students in a research paradigm like that, because they're like, we'll just tell them that they're similar or they're not, and see how it affects their decision making. And it's like, and it worked, and it was just like amazing. So really cool. So some evidence that this is true, but it can also backfire, and here's where we get into trouble. Similar how and under what circumstances. The black sheep effect, group members may in some circumstances be harder on members of their own group, especially when the behavior has consequences for the group or reflects poorly on all members. So they want to make an example of this person. No, we are not like this. This person is an outlier. They're a black sheep. Throw the book at them. All right? But bottom line, perceptions of similarity can occur across almost any dimension. So, what do all the foregoing methods have in common? Some form of stereotyping, right? The reliance on an average type. I want to shift gears. Let's go and try something else out here. This is a crazy one, but it's admirable in its craziness, right? I don't know if I would ever want my attorney to do this, but think about it. Maybe put yourself in the defendant's chair during voir dire. And in this case, the first 12 called approach is my attorney challenges no one, right? They don't challenge anyone. And it may be based on negative past experiences or of more conventional techniques, or wasting money on jury advisors, etc., not getting anywhere with that. And notice that if you want to pull this off, what you're probably going to do is do a big show, and it's going to, like, you walk in, and remember, we might think that the trial has already started per se, and what I do is I come in and I say, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here. The jury selection process, I think, is fraught with all kinds of difficulties, but here's the deal. We don't need to concern ourselves with this, because I am so certain that any of you would find my client not guilty, that the prosecution's evidence is so weak and their case is so ill-advised that I don't need to select any jurors. The first 12 of you are good for me. Any 12 of you are good for me. So that being said, let's just get started. And if you can pull this shit off, right, then the jurors are already indoctrinated to say, wow, this guy feels really strongly about the innocence of his client to the extent that he'll do this. People might be impressed by that. Then again, they might not. So, the first 12 called. A little different. Now, I want to get into personality constructs, and we run into this issue. Should personality constructs actually be a criteria? Should I give jurors, we can give jurors questionnaires. How do you feel about Black Lives Matter? How do you feel about the thin blue line? How do you feel about all these things that, as it relates to the case, right, to maybe disqualify jurors? But what about assessing jurors' personality characteristics as being useful or detrimental to your case? And this is not allowed to the same extent. We can see where there's problems. In our research in our laboratory, though, we, of course, because it's in a laboratory, we did some of this. And one personality construct that we looked at that might be predictive of people's decision-making when they decide to punish is authoritarianism. There's a lot of evidence that people who are high in authoritarianism are more likely to vote for conviction and impose more severe sentences. Additionally, high authoritarians usually have a lower threshold for the evidence they need to convict. So they're willing to convict on far weaker or far more sparse evidence, right? Now, it used to be measured by the F scale back when Adorno was doing this. Identifies people who rigidly adhere to traditional values, identify with and submit to authority, and behave punitively towards norm violators. And it's especially that last part. But notice authoritarians are more willing to take the word of police officers as well, right? But it may boomerang when the defendant symbolizes authority, that is, they may become more lenient. And there's been some research done here where when it's police officers who committed the crime, authoritarians are more willing to look the other way or become more lenient. So, now sometimes this is measured by right-wing authoritarianism. This is the more modern measure and developed by Robert Altmaier. So how might right-wing authoritarianism interact with information? Well, what we did is we randomly assigned people to word puzzle conditions, right, prior to the actual experiment. So the way this research, and this is what we usually did when we were in a priming phase, is we bring people in a laboratory, and our methodology is pretty straightforward. We say, hey, okay, so you're here for your experimental credit. You're engaging in the REP study. And they say, yeah. And I say, so you get 1 credit for this experiment. It's a half hour. But here's the deal. My main experiment's like 5 minutes. So what I've got is I got 4 other experiments that I'm combining. And all told, you'll still be out of here in less than a half hour. I just don't want to give you a point for 5 minutes, right? And students go, okay, well, fine. So what we would typically do is the first or second experiment is a priming manipulation. It's to change some aspect of their current state so that perhaps we think they may become more lenient or they may become more punitive. And that allows us to see if that environmental stimulus causes people to change their perceptions and thus their decisions, right? So we had people like do word puzzles prior to the actual experiment. And then participants are to read a case about the criminal and asked to assess the level of guilt, how guilty are they, and to what extent should they be punished or how much punishment. Now, this is going to look insanely stupid, but believe it or not, it works. So you might be randomly assigned to a condition where you're given, let's say, 10 or 15 of these, I don't even know what to call them. And about 5 of them are going to be geared to priming people to want to punish more. So we use synonyms for punishment or punish, right? And basically what people are told to do, this is a letter recognition task, so we want you to do this as quickly as you can. Just blank out the X's and then write the word next to it as quickly as you can. And we'd stand there like with a stopwatch and we would say go, and people would just blaze through them, thinking that they're doing a separate experiment. The key words, the target words, which are embedded with a bunch of neutral words as well, so that it isn't too obvious what we're trying to do. Punish. What's the second word? Control. And we'll have about, now we used to use scramble word tasks, but they took too long, right? So now we develop this task and it worked just as well. Now this is, the idea is someone's randomly assigned this condition and then they read the court case, this will motivate them, this will prime them to become more punitive, that is, assign harsher punishments. Now, the flip side is we have a lenient condition, so you might be randomly assigned to this condition, and embedded in there somewhere is mercy, forgive. So again, about 15 of these, right, in either condition. 5 are directly trying to manipulate behavior, and then the other 10 are neutral to throw people off, right? What do we see then? Well, what we tend to see then is the likelihood of guilt, finding someone less likely to find them guilty, right? In the lenient condition with mild severity, see what we see is those people primed in the lenient condition are less likely to find, or they find a lower likelihood of guilt. Those in the harsh condition are more likely to find the person guilty. And we also manipulate the victim's injuries as mild or severe, and we see one effect that we uncovered all the time, and this is kind of our gold standard, is the more severe the injury, the more the desire to punish. That is, the more guilty someone is perceived to be. But notice, the severity of the injury has nothing to do with guilt. Fascinating, this kind of research. So, now, what about the high right-wing authoritarianism? Well, the interaction between the punitive prime and the participant right-wing authoritarianism significantly predicted increased punitiveness over the control condition, right? So this is the interesting thing about priming, and of course we were just learning about priming during these studies coming out of 1999, 2000. Priming became all the rage, right? What we find is that people who have higher levels of right-wing authoritarianism were more sensitive to the punitive primes. So whereas low RWAs might not have been influenced by the punitive primes, high RWAs, man, they really were influenced dramatically. Right? And what this means is people who are in an authoritarian state move about their world on a day-to-day basis looking to come down on people. Right? That's essentially what we see. Now, other personality constructs that might make a difference? Well, Julian Rotter's locus of control. Locus of control, if I have an internal locus of control, what that means is I believe that my life outcomes came from me. That is, I'm responsible for what happens to me. I'm responsible for where I am. That means my view of what makes shit happen for me, it comes from me. Now, people with a more external locus of control, and it's a continuum, right? They believe that other people or events control what happens. So these people are big fans of luck, the lottery, etc., right? Us internals slavishly work so we can put money aside so we can retire in some level of comfort. Externals are more likely to plunk down some money on the lottery and hope that they win so they can retire comfortably, right? So, external seems to externalize to others. Internal view defendants as more responsible and punish more. If I hold myself accountable for my life outcomes, then when I look at someone in the defendant's chair, it stands to reason I'm going to look at them as being more responsible for being in that defendant's chair. Whereas externals might be willing to say, wow, that person, caught a bad break, or, they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. An internal is going to say, no, I put myself in the wrong place at the wrong time. So we can see this is a personality trait that might, in fact, be somewhat predictive of jury decision-making, at least it is in the laboratory. Civil trials, especially sensitive to any role that the plaintiff played, right? So if I'm suing a chainsaw manufacturer for an injury, people with internal locus of control might be hard to convince, because we're looking at, well, to what extent did that person make a mistake in the way they were operating that chainsaw? Did they contribute to their injury even in the slightest? So, that being said, let's get back to this idea, can lawyers pick juries? Well, they are very confident in their abilities, but what we see is that jury selection strategies weren't different or better than those used by students in a laboratory setting, right? They did no better than chance at guessing which jurors were likely to be biased against them. So for the money spent and the confidence people have, maybe that first 12 called is just the way to go. Summing up jury selection, many techniques rely on stereotyping, right? Individual personality characteristics may be difficult, or we might not be allowed to assess, right? Personality characteristics interact with situational variables in very complex ways, as we found with priming punitiveness and people are high in authoritarian control, as demonstrated on their right-wing authoritarianism scores. But lawyer self-esteem can be tied very tightly to their ability to predict or to pick jurors. And then finally we come up against this wall of what exactly constitutes fair and representative. And something else I learned in reading that BBC article, I was not aware of, but I'm not surprised. In Great Britain, jury trials are relatively uncommon. But jury trials, the jurors are just randomly assigned to the case. There is no selection process. They're just randomly assigned. And I have to step back and wonder and say, is there a problem with that? I'll leave that, because that's a big question, right? Is there a problem with that? I don't know. I'll leave that to you guys. So, you guys have a great day. We're done for now. And then the second part of homework number 9 is reflected in lecture 13. So check that out when you're able. Take care.